The world is scope locked on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Joining us today on Newsmakers are two Missouri Southern professors who are going to help us understand the current situation and give us some historical perspective on the two countries. Thanks for joining us. We have Dr. Will Delahanty, right? Associate Professor of Political Science, and Dr. Rebecca Shriver, Assistant Professor of History. Thanks for joining us today.
Sure.
So tell us what the political significance is of this invasion and how it challenges the post-war or post-Cold War security in Europe.
Well, as was kind of alluded to last night with President Biden in his State of the Union address, after the end of the Cold War, the idea was to somehow provide for collective security and defense against the possibility of, in some ways, the former Soviet Union, right. from extending its sphere of influence. Rules were built, right, to kind of maintain the collective security and defense of Europe, including NATO. And so when Putin decided to invade Ukraine, he essentially acted in a way that violated the existing rules of the game, such that, as you can kind of see in European response, in the Germans' response, for example, kind of a cataclysmic shift in terms of how to deal with right, this kind of violation of the ongoing, right, existing rules of at least European security. So I think Putin's decision to invade is incredibly important in the sense that we now get to see how the West will react. We've seen sanctions and those sorts of things. It's also interesting, right, that Ukraine is not, right, a NATO member, and so they have this ambiguous status relative to other, right, very close neighboring states that are in fact members. So,
and they were trying, right, to become a NATO member, or was that sort of like in the talks?
Well, I think at some point in the past they had made overtures, right, to join, and maybe Dr. Shriver can kind of clarify too. I know that Zelensky has kind of made formal overtures to join, I think, the EU in conjunction, right, maybe possibly with NATO. So Ukraine has this very interesting status, and Biden, for example, mentioned it last night, stating that we're going to defend NATO territory, but then won't, if you will, use the might and force of the United States military to, and NATO allies to defend Ukraine. So it's a very different kind of experience.
Well, and I guess what does Putin think will come of this invasion? I mean, what's his end game? Do you know? Or can you suppose?
Well, I mean, he certainly seems to be interested in rebuilding sort of this older, a new form of the Russian Empire. He claims that, having any kind of country close by that was a member of NATO or the EU was a threat to Russian security, which of course is a lie. Sure. This is an opportunity, he sees it as an opportunity to reclaim territory that used to belong to the Russian Empire, and for various reasons. I mean, and particularly since 2014, in Ukraine, you see a lot of anti-corruption cases, a lot of rhetoric about the importance of democracy and justice, and ideologically that's threatening to Putin. So, but it opens the door for him to potentially, try to reclaim lands that the Russian Empire had occupied for a very long time in the 18th and 19th century.
Yeah, talk about that. They have a shared heritage.
I'm sorry, I mean, it goes back, Ukrainian nationalism, at least, prior to the 19th century, there was a clearly shared sense of community in the Ukrainian region. They had the same language and customs and traditions. That was quite different from what you found in Russia, like up around Moscow. So the Ukrainian nation goes back 4 centuries as being distinctive from Russia. But after the Russian Empire invaded the region, they invaded the east half of Ukrainian territory in the 1660s, and then the entirety of what we now call Ukraine in the late 1700s. So, that's when they kind of moved in. And after they started seeing a resurgence in a nationalist movement in Ukraine in the 19th century, which you see all over Europe. Sure. It's not just in Ukraine, but these really strong nationalist movements that were fighting for their own nation state. I mean, that was when the idea of a nation state really emerged was during that time period. So this is threatening to multinational empires because it's, they potentially could dissolve. So that's when you see the Russian Empire start to try to eliminate the nationalist movement in Ukraine, putting in all these laws against Ukrainian language and cultural elites, and what they call trying to Russify Ukraine. And then you see the same thing happen under Stalin later, after the Russian Empire collapsed and the Soviet Union began. Really, horrific efforts to eliminate Ukrainian nationalism and Ukrainian nation and replace it with Russians from, further east. So.
And in 2014, they call it the annexation of Crimea, but they really just took over that southeastern part. And I read it was basically because of the help of a Navy commander who was pro-Russia, and he just handed over the keys to the country, basically, or that section of it. And
yeah, the area in Crimea, this is one area where Stalin and under the Soviet Union, they really tried to forcefully move people from further east into Crimea to make claim that it is Russian territory by and I didn't mention this earlier, but I mean in the 1930s Stalin implements a plan for collecting all the food from Ukraine, and it creates this massive famine and killing millions of Ukrainians. And he replaced them with people from further east. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of people either, some people moved back into what was going to be formerly Russia, and then you see a really strong nationalist unity in 1991, wanting to form their own independent state.
And they've done a pretty decent job thus far until Crimea, and then all of the efforts made since then. Dr. Delhanty, talk about the social media battle, or I guess just internet.
Sure.
The Russians have a storied history of, all of the cyber warfare. And do you see that as, obviously social media is newer,
Sure.
it's a newer weapon.
Sure.
Talk about that.
Well, I mean, actually, I think you're right. I mean, it's a way for Russians to kind of engage in conflict without, at least initially, using force. It's still coercive. But the other thing that I think is really interesting about social media use, particularly within Ukraine, and maybe in other societies too, like in Russia, is the degree to which it becomes a mechanism of mobilization. So you've got information coming out of Ukraine that contradicts, the official statements and ideas of, the Kremlin, for example.
Sure.
And so information becomes a tool, I think, of the Ukrainians that the Russians, no matter how hard they try, they can't control. So it's kind of, it's a way for the Ukrainians to fight back, not only in terms of their use of force, but also the information they can get to people outside of Ukraine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and you see in America, there's always these warring factions of the parties, but it seems like right now on American social media, anyways, everybody is united for Ukraine. I don't see much in the way of pro-Russia.
Well, the thing that I find kind of interesting is not so much that the opposition to, say, the coalition of Biden is pro-Russia, but there has been some language used by conservatives to argue, Republicans, that Biden is weak.
Right.
That supposedly, his use of sanctions is somehow indicating that he's not willing to go to the next step. And I'm not sure if that's obviously fair, because it turns out Ukraine is just very, different in the sense relative to the other states that are very close by. So states that are very close to Poland, for example, they're members of NATO, whereas Ukraine is not. And so the distinction is important for purposes of using collective defense and force, but I think there are some domestically in the United States that take Biden to task for not going the next step. And he may have learned from problems in Afghanistan and Iraq and those sorts of things why he wouldn't
Syria.
why he wouldn't want to go that next step. But I think consensus is to support Ukraine and to kind of engage with sanctions.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I heard last night that they were going to sell ballistic missiles and all this armament to Ukraine directly, which I think, good move, but is it too little too late? There's convoys of of Russian military, like right on the edges of Kiev, and
Yes, yeah.
is it Kirkuk? I don't know how to pronounce that other big city that they're invading right now.
Kharkiv, maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a couple colleagues, one that is in Kiev right now, and
wow.
she posts 5 or 6 social media posts every day to kind of update us on what's going on, and I mean the local militaries in the territorial defense are doing a really. I think they are putting up a fight that Putin never intended, and they're going to stay there and defend their country.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I think it's really, it's hard, it's gut wrenching, but it's also, I think that they are doing everything they can, and hopefully that we can continue to support them however we can. So.
Yeah, I've seen some of the video, and they showed one yesterday where they blew up a local government office, and that was pretty horrifying to watch it just explode. And I thought, oh, there's going to be thousands of people, but they know they've gone already to where they need to be, so that a lot of people are safer. I don't know if the underground subways are, they're like bomb shelters.
Well, and there are lots of people fleeing Ukraine. I mean, so,
yeah.
I mean, one of the, I think, and maybe Dr. Trevor, you can kind of clarify, but I mean, migration of people, right, in refugee status is going to be, I mean, a potentially very significant question following whatever the end is, right, to this conflict. I mean, how are Western European states and neighboring, right, NATO allies going to, I'm assuming at this point they seem to be welcoming them and bringing them in, but that migration problem has been one that's been particularly difficult for, I think, states in kind of, the south of Europe, right, relative to Western Europe.
Yeah, and I mean, Poland has already accepted, hundreds of thousands of refugees from Ukraine, and I think that that's another way that we really can, help and support without being militarily engaged is certainly helping with the refugee efforts and supporting the UN with their refugee organizations and giving them resources and materials and yeah.
Well, and back to social media, I was telling you that there's a post going around that lists out, I mean, it's a long list. Ukraine is 5th in this and 4th in this, and, of all these natural minerals and mining. And I read yesterday they have the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, the 5th largest in the world, but the largest in Europe. And I kept thinking, are these true? And I checked them out. And yeah, most of them are true. Some of them are a little outdated, but does that matter? I mean, why Ukraine? Is it because of those things, or is it, this is Putin?
It probably plays a little bit of the role. I mean, I can't imagine that there isn't benefits to Putin for taking over a country that has those natural resources. So it probably plays into some of his calculus. But I think the history that Dr. Shriver was talking about, I mean, really probably does a better job of conditioning why Putin would choose Ukraine. It's also true, though, I mean, from my point of view, Ukraine is strategic in the sense that violating their sovereignty doesn't immediately engender, right, a collective defense response from NATO. So he gets this benefit of the ambiguity, right, of their status. But it's also true, I think they, so the Russians pay Passover fees to ship oil, right, through Ukrainian territory as well. So, I mean, so controlling that territory would free them up, right, for purposes of those fees that they, or pass-through fees, I should say. And, the Russian economy is very much dependent on their ability to export natural gas. So there's a strategic benefit of having, right, Ukraine's territory in that sense, too.
Absolutely. I mean, historically speaking, I mean, the area has been extremely important agriculturally and for the natural resources. And, those key ports along the Black Sea is important strategically, economically. So for all those reasons, Russia, as well as other empires through the centuries have tried to occupy the region, but it continues to be the case that it is valuable economically, but also I think the ideological threat, and from Putin's perspective, was a big deal.
So do you think, and again, this is just gaming out and speculating on what he'll do, but there were other countries that were part of the Soviet Union, all in that region. So what's next? I mean, he pretty much has Belarus, but there are others. Do you think it's going to continue?
I think the problem is that so for example, trying to invade Poland, I think would be a strategic error on his part, mainly because immediately right.
That is NATO.
That is NATO. So I think he's trying to tread, in some ways, on their doorstep, but without kind of inciting their defensive response, right? Which I think collectively would be overwhelming with respect to the Russians. But the other thing that's kind of interesting, the background also is the Chinese. So I'm not sure if in part Putin is operating on the expectation that he would get some kind of support from the Chinese, although I think the Chinese have now come out kind of being somewhat critical publicly, right? And the economic costs are starting to kind of take their toll. So I don't think he would go any further.
Yeah, they voted today with the UN to, whatever the proclamation was, to, I don't even know what it's called, but they voted, saying it's bad.
Yes.
Stop what you're doing.
Right, denouncing it, yes.
Yeah, denouncing, that's the right word. And I think they said 5 countries who voted, or I guess 4, Russia voted for itself, but North Korea, and there were a couple of others, and they're like, it's kind of a telltale sign of the company you keep.
Sure.
And so it's countries you would expect, but then also countries like Cuba and Venezuela that abstained from the vote, so they didn't vote for Russia.
Sure.
Which is kind of a signal as well.
Yeah, says something about their interests.
Right.
Yeah.
And so talk about the most recent history for Russia once the Soviet Union fell. Putin's trying to rewrite history and say, oh, that was just a mistake. They didn't really mean to let Ukraine go.
Well, I think that Putin is still, in some ways, he was a KGB officer living in Dresden when the wall fell, and he just felt like it was this great tragedy. But even in kind of post-Soviet Russia, you see, especially in recent years, his attempt to try to conjure these images of a grand Russian empire, that old empire that I mentioned. And I think that it's more reflective of imperial Russia than maybe necessarily the Soviet Union. But certainly, I think that that's still seen in his eyes as a tragedy when the Soviet Union collapsed. But in Ukraine, they're one of the first states to break away from the Soviet Union, to vote to form their own independent state, with over 92% of the population voting in favor of forming an independent Ukrainian state. And although in the early years, there's a lot of distrust of the government, because the government had always kind of been against Ukrainians. So it took a while to kind of conjure this kind of sense of civic duty and democratic society, but it has, by now with a new generation, you see that has certainly taken root in the country. So
there's 30 years of people being free for the most part, that they don't know the other way of life and they don't want to go back to it.
Historically now, they kind of very much pull on the connection of Ukraine to the Cossacks of the 1600s, which were a semi-democratic military group. And they oftentimes kind of compare Ukraine to being a symbol of democracy versus the autocracy coming in from Russia. And so that's part of the historical national identity now.
Yeah. So what's the world to do about Vladimir Putin? I mean, what can they do? I know I read that his term as president, dictator, whatever, it runs out, according to their constitution that they just implemented a couple years ago, in 2020, I think, that he's out in 2036. Do you think the world was just trying to wait him out, hoping he wouldn't do this?
Well, I don't know. The short-term effect, the sanctions that we're talking about that the West has imposed are really, really significant. So banning Russian banks from the SWIFT, kind of messaging, system, banning air travel, from Russian origin. So all those things, I think, So I don't know. Dr. Trevor might have a different opinion, but my thinking is that the sanctions will take a toll in the sense that the people who fund or support Putin for a variety of reasons in Russia will eventually feel so much pain that they can't sustain it. And I think he may be subject to an internal coup. I mean, as a function of those moneyed interests just simply saying we can't stand this any longer.
And he doesn't let people close to him. Like I saw a news story the other day that they don't get within so many feet of him. That's
in the last couple of years that has become particularly the case. Some have speculated it's actually connected to his fear of COVID, but he won't let anyone physically close to them, and they have to quarantine for over 2 weeks if you want to actually be in his presence. He's another historian. I was listening to an interview with her yesterday, and she was saying that her sources there are suggesting that mainly he only talks to his bodyguards. So it's. I think that hopefully, there are a lot of very powerful financial backers of Putin, and they are going to be hurting right now. Right? So we'll see if they're able to put pressure and change the administration there.
Well, and when I hear that they're going to take away their yachts and they're this and they're that, and it's like, really, yachts? Do they care? But it's money. Yeah,
I think the idea, people, there are a select group of people in Russia then who have become very wealthy as a function of, Putin's policies over time. And so to have these sanctions, and Biden mentioned it last night, but I think it's probably useful to reiterate. The degree of unity in the European response is particularly interesting. The Germans have a long history of kind of divorcing their political response from their economic interests. But that's just not simply the case now. And so that I don't know. It seems like Europe is very much committed to this regime of sanctions, and they think it will work. No, go for it.
You mentioned unity here in the U.S. between political parties. Unity throughout NATO and throughout the EU is also equally impressive, and I think speaks to how serious the situation is. But also, I think that it should give, particularly Ukrainians, hope that and we'll be able to see a positive future for them.
What do you think about their president? He seems to be, he's a pretty tough guy.
Yeah, he has an interesting career.
Right?
From comedian to
television.
War president. He seems to motivate people. And he does make good use of social media as a way to kind of make his points known. And he very much has lots of interactions with high-ranking officials in the EU. He seems very impressive.
He was an actor before, and he seems to he really commits to his roles. Right? And his role right now is to be president. And he's not going to abandon Ukrainians. I think that's, why he's saying, no, I will not leave. I am going to fulfill this role. And I think he's doing a wonderful job.
Yeah, and back to social media. I've heard it said that, hearts and minds can be changed. And there's a lot of Russians who are tired of, the way that they're allowed to exist, if you will. And that because of social media, the European countries in the West can do so much more with regard to influence. Do you think the hearts and the minds of the Russian people can be changed?
Well, I was just listening this morning to an independent agency in Russia that said that they've arrested over 7,000 protesters in Russia so far. Including a dog in St. Petersburg. They detained a dog.
7,000 people.
But they're facing fines, jail time, which is horrible. But the protests are happening there. Which if you can imagine being in a state such as Russia and knowing that you could probably end up being detained or be arrested and face jail time, it speaks really loudly to how much they are opposed to this war.
Yeah, a lot of social activists in America went through that, and I can see, people are going to do what they need to do to be free. Freedom's contagious.
Well, the other thing too, I mean, with the Russians, I mean, the sanctions we were talking about earlier, I think ordinary Russians, people that are not the oligarchs, are going to, I mean, they feel the effects of this stuff.
Sure.
And so it's just a matter of time. The thing that I find interesting in an autocracy, or, right, not really kind of a public democracy, I mean, it's not entirely clear that Putin has to be responsive to the claims and the concerns of the Russian public. But at some point, though, I mean, in my own mind, I'm thinking the public will no longer tolerate what Putin is doing, and so there'll be public pressure in conjunction with elite to kind of transform his behavior.
Yeah.
Social media might help facilitate that pressure over time.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and then there's the threat of nuclear power. You know, putting his nuclear defense forces on alert. Is it just saber rattling? Are people actually? I mean, I lived through the Cold War. Bomb shelters.
Yeah, I mean, so the thing, so kind of what I've been reading is something like Putin could have made that decision privately. So another way of putting it, he could have signaled to his forces to increase their alertness or whatever. But he decided to do it in an incredibly public setting, in full view not only of a consuming public, but also, right, his military brass. And so it makes me think you're probably right that it's a form of saber rattling, but the question is, to whom is he rattling? I'm not
Right.
I don't know who the audience is, because I'm not entirely sure that Putin really, he makes these threats to escalate and do these things. I'm not entirely sure that he necessarily wants to use them, or he wants to be seen that way, but not necessarily going to, in fact, use them. But I guess I could be wrong.
I mean, I think it's hard without having a lot of people close to him, you know, without him allowing any people within his inner circle to know his state of mind, and what he's thinking, what his end goal is. I do worry about, you know, he does seem like he's pretty unhinged or fragile, and the worry that what he could do if things don't go the way that he anticipated, which obviously they have not. But yeah.
Well, the other thing too, I mean, with deterrence theory, I mean, the idea, of course, is having them means that you won't use them.
Right.
But if Putin uses them, I mean, if his logic is to create, right, this, historical entity of the Russian Empire, his use of those weapons will engender a response that destroys the very thing he's trying to create. And that's
what I thought too. Yeah.
But, so my hope is that deterrence would work in that way. And NATO is also, I mean, they have those kinds of weapons as well.
Sure.
So I mean, it's not just a state-based reaction, but a collective defense force reaction.
And I think that what thing that you said about what people are thinking about him and him not letting them know what he's thinking, he kept saying up until the day he launched the missiles and the bombs, they were just exercises. So he didn't tell people he was actually going to invade. He just did it.
Right.
So I guess the threat is sort of,
Yeah, it seems.
why would he
posturing.
threat? Yeah, posturing. Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you two coming on. It really has helped us with the understanding of a little bit better about the situation.
We appreciate your
for having
time.
us.
You bet. I want to say thank you to Dr. Will Delahanty and Dr. Rebecca Shriver for joining us today to talk about the importance of Ukraine and the current Russian invasion. This is Newsmakers on KGCS TV from the Ruth Copeland Studios here at Missouri Southern State University, and I'm Bobby Potroff. We'll see you again soon.